The strangest part of this story is not that a man lost his career. It is that a dog remembered something everyone else wanted forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your state or country below. And if you believe the truth does not always live inside official reports, stay with me. Because this story was never supposed to reach daylight. The storm arrived over northern Montana just after midnight. Freezing rain hammered the mountains while powerful winds swept across miles of open wilderness. Roads disappeared beneath black ice. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Emergency crews gathered near an aging flood control facility located nearly 30 miles outside town, where rushing water had overwhelmed a network of drainage tunnels built decades earlier. Floodlights illuminated sheets of rain blowing sideways through the darkness. Engines idled. Radios crackled. The smell of wet concrete mixed with diesel fuel and cold mountain air. Officer Daniel Mercer stood near the command vehicle watching the tunnel entrance. At 57 years old, Daniel had spent 35 years in law enforcement. He was respected, experienced, and only months away from retirement. Most officers his age were already thinking about life after the badge. Daniel had been doing the same. But tonight, none of that mattered. Because somewhere beneath thousands of tons of concrete and steel, a police K-9 named Axel was trapped. Earlier that evening, search teams had been deployed after structural alarms sounded inside the flood control system. Axel had entered one section of the tunnel during the operation. Minutes later, part of the structure collapsed. The dog never came back out. Engineers quickly evaluated the damage. Their conclusion was simple. The tunnel had become too dangerous. Water levels continued rising. Additional collapse zones were possible. Rescue personnel had already attempted 2 entries and failed to locate the dog. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, command made its decision. The operation was terminated. All personnel were ordered to withdraw immediately. Daniel stared at the dark opening of the tunnel. Rainwater rushed from the entrance in fast-moving streams. Flashlight beams danced across broken concrete. Around him, rescue crews slowly began packing equipment. Nobody argued with the decision. The evidence supported it completely. The risk was too high. The procedure was clear. Then Daniel heard something. At first he thought it was the wind. But the sound came again. Faint. Distant. A single bark echoing. From somewhere deep underground. Daniel froze. The noise lasted less than a second before disappearing into the roar of the storm. He looked toward the tunnel entrance. Nobody else seemed to notice. A younger officer approached carrying a flashlight. "They are shutting everything down," he said. Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness. The radio on his shoulder repeated the withdrawal order. All personnel were to evacuate the area. No further rescue attempts were authorized. The younger officer followed Daniel's gaze toward the tunnel. "There is nothing anyone can do now." Daniel finally looked at him. "I heard him." The officer hesitated. "What?" "Axel." Another bark drifted through the storm. Weak. Barely audible. But unmistakable. Daniel removed his gloves slowly. Cold rain struck his hands. Around him, emergency lights flashed across puddles and wet pavement. Somewhere beyond the flood control site, thunder rolled across the mountains. Every report said the rescue was over. Every expert said the tunnel was unsafe. Every rule said he should walk away. Yet Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. Axel was still alive. He unclipped his radio and handed it to the younger officer. Confusion spread across the man's face. "Daniel, do not do this." Daniel looked back toward the tunnel entrance. Water surged from the darkness like a river. The storm seemed louder now. Closer. "Tell them I am sorry," he said quietly. Then he turned and ran. Voices shouted behind him. Orders followed. Someone called his name. Daniel ignored all of it. Within seconds the darkness swallowed him. Behind him, the storm continued raging. Ahead of him, somewhere beneath concrete, rushing water, and years of forgotten secrets, a loyal dog was waiting. Neither of them knew that before sunrise, Daniel would step closer to a hidden truth than anyone had in nearly a decade. The tunnel felt colder the deeper Daniel Mercer went. Water surged around his boots while his flashlight beam cut through darkness thick with mist and drifting dust. Somewhere ahead, beyond twisted metal and damaged concrete, Axel was still alive. Daniel could hear him now. Not clearly. Just enough to keep moving. A bark. Then silence. Another bark. Closer this time. The storm outside seemed far away. Inside the tunnel there was only darkness, rushing water, and the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing. He moved around collapsed sections of wall and ducked beneath hanging pipes. Several times he stopped to listen. Each time the answer came back. Axel was still there. Then the flashlight found him. The German Shepherd stood trapped behind a section of bent steel grating partially buried beneath debris. Mud covered his coat. One shoulder appeared injured, though not severely. His eyes reflected brightly in the beam of light. For a moment neither moved. Then Axel stepped forward as far as the twisted metal allowed. Daniel felt relief hit him harder than he expected. "Easy, buddy," he said quietly. Axel responded with a low sound and waited. Around them, the tunnel groaned beneath the pressure of rushing water. Daniel immediately began working on the obstruction. The steel had been bent inward during the collapse. It was heavy and partially pinned beneath concrete fragments. Several attempts failed. His hands slipped repeatedly against cold metal. Then finally one section shifted. Just enough. Axel squeezed through the opening and immediately moved to Daniel's side. Another deep rumble echoed through the tunnel. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Daniel grabbed his flashlight. Time to go. Together they started back toward the entrance. Twice Axel stopped and looked toward a side corridor disappearing into darkness. The behavior struck Daniel as odd. The dog seemed focused on something deeper inside the structure. Something beyond the rescue route. "Come on," Daniel said. Axel hesitated briefly before following. Minutes later they emerged into the storm. Flashing emergency lights illuminated the rain. Several rescue workers rushed forward. Some cheered. Others looked stunned. Axel was quickly examined by veterinary personnel while paramedics checked Daniel for injuries. The rescue had succeeded. The dog was alive. Yet the atmosphere felt strangely cold. Daniel noticed it immediately. Nobody from command looked relieved. Several supervisors stood near the command vehicle speaking quietly among themselves. One of them was Regional Operations Director Richard Holloway. Holloway watched Daniel from a distance without smiling. The expression on his face seemed impossible to read. Later that morning, after the storm had finally begun moving east, Daniel returned home exhausted. Local news stations quickly picked up the story. Reporters praised the rescue. Social media called him a hero. For a few days, it seemed as though the entire community supported what he had done. Then the tone changed. Internal reviews were announced. Questions appeared regarding procedure violations. Department officials emphasized that Daniel had ignored direct orders. Risk assessments were discussed. Safety protocols were mentioned repeatedly. The story slowly shifted away from the rescue itself. 3 days later, Daniel attended an administrative interview. Holloway sat at the far end of the room. So did several department representatives. A television mounted on the wall displayed slides showing tunnel schematics, risk evaluations, and official directives. Every piece of evidence supported the department's position. Daniel had entered a dangerous structure after being ordered not to. He had endangered himself. He had disregarded command authority. Everything being said was technically true. Yet something felt wrong. Holloway seemed unusually invested in the outcome. More invested than necessary. At one point Daniel noticed a framed photograph hanging on the conference room wall. It showed several officials attending a public safety event years earlier. Among them stood a well-known consultant frequently seen on national television discussing emergency preparedness. Thomas Vance. Daniel barely paid attention to the image before the meeting continued. At the time, it meant nothing. 2 weeks later, the department reached its decision. Daniel Mercer was terminated. 35 years of service ended with a formal letter and a signature. As he walked out of headquarters carrying a small cardboard box, Axel waited beside his truck in the parking lot. The German Shepherd rose immediately when he saw him. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's neck and looked back at the building one final time. He believed his career had ended because he chose loyalty over procedure. He did not yet realize that the night he rescued Axel, he had unknowingly stepped into a story that had begun years before either of them arrived at that tunnel. Winter arrived early across Greystone Lake. By the middle of December, the water had frozen into a sheet of dull silver stretching nearly 3 miles across the valley. Pine trees stood motionless beneath fresh snow. Most mornings began in silence. No radio calls. No patrol briefings. No reports waiting on a desk. For the first time in 35 years, Daniel Mercer had nowhere he needed to be. After losing his career, he moved into a small cabin overlooking the lake nearly 70 miles from town. The place had belonged to his father decades earlier. It was simple. One stone fireplace. A wooden dock extending toward the shoreline. Endless wilderness in every direction. Friends told him retirement might be good for him. Daniel tried to believe them. Some days he almost did. Axel adapted quickly. His shoulder had healed completely after the rescue. During daylight hours, the German Shepherd explored trails through the woods, watched deer moving through the snow, and slept near the fireplace while Daniel read old books or repaired things around the cabin. But after sunset, something changed. The behavior started gradually. At first Daniel barely noticed it. Around the same time every evening, Axel would leave the cabin and disappear into the darkness. An hour later he would return. Then it happened again the next night. And the night after that. Eventually Daniel began paying attention. The pattern never varied. Shortly after dark, Axel followed the same narrow trail through the trees leading toward the northern shoreline of Greystone Lake. He never chased wildlife. Never wandered. Never changed direction. The route remained identical every time. One evening Daniel decided to follow him. Snow crunched beneath his boots while moonlight reflected across the frozen lake. The air smelled clean and sharp. Somewhere in the distance a lone coyote called across the valley. Axel moved confidently through the darkness as though he knew exactly where he was going. After nearly 15 minutes, he reached a cluster of frozen reeds growing along the edge of the lake. Then he stopped. Daniel watched from a distance. Axel sat facing the ice. Completely still. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The German Shepherd never moved. His eyes remained fixed on one specific location near the shoreline. Daniel approached carefully. "What are you looking at?" Axel did not respond. The dog simply continued staring. Daniel examined the area. There was nothing unusual. No tracks. No animals. No movement beneath the ice. Eventually he convinced Axel to return home. The next night, the dog went back. The same place. The same routine. The same unwavering focus. After nearly 2 weeks, Daniel could no longer dismiss it as habit. Something was drawing Axel there. Something important enough that the dog returned every night regardless of weather. One evening a winter storm rolled across the valley. Snow fell heavily. Wind gusts reached nearly 40 miles per hour. Visibility dropped dramatically. Daniel assumed Axel would stay inside. Instead, shortly after dark, the German Shepherd walked to the door and waited. Daniel sighed and grabbed his coat. 15 minutes later they stood once again beside the frozen reeds. Snow swirled around them. The lake looked almost invisible beyond the blowing white haze. Axel stepped forward and lowered his nose toward the ice. Then something unexpected happened. The German Shepherd released a low sound. Not a growl. Not fear. Recognition. Daniel felt a chill move through him. He had heard working dogs make that sound before. It happened when they encountered a familiar scent or remembered a location connected to training. Yet Axel had never lived near Greystone Lake. At least not as far as Daniel knew. The dog suddenly began pawing at the snow covering the shoreline. Not aggressively. methodically, as if searching for something beneath the surface. Daniel watched in silence. After several minutes, Axel stopped and looked directly at him. The expression felt almost deliberate. Daniel glanced from the dog to the frozen ground. Then back again. A strange feeling settled over him. The same feeling he used to get during investigations when a witness revealed something important without saying a word. For the first time, Daniel stopped wondering why Axel kept returning to the lake. Instead, he began wondering what the dog was trying to show him. The next morning, Daniel Mercer returned to the shoreline carrying a shovel, an ice chisel, and a growing sense that Axel was leading him toward something real. The storm from the night before had passed. Fresh snow covered the lake in a smooth white blanket that stretched to the distant tree line. The air was still, cold enough that every breath drifted visibly before disappearing into the morning sunlight. Axel walked ahead without hesitation. He followed the familiar route through the trees and stopped beside the same cluster of frozen reeds. Then he lowered his nose toward the ground and waited. Daniel looked carefully at the area. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then sunlight reflected off something buried beneath the snow near the edge of the ice. A small metallic surface. Barely visible. Daniel crouched and brushed away the snow. A dull piece of metal protruded from the frozen ground. It could have been anything. An old tool. A discarded part. Something left behind years ago. Yet Axel remained focused on it. Daniel began digging. The frozen soil resisted every movement. Ice and packed earth had fused together over countless winters. Nearly 30 minutes passed before he exposed enough of the object to understand what he was looking at. It was not a loose piece of metal. It was attached to something larger buried beneath the shoreline. Daniel worked for another hour. Eventually a weathered waterproof container emerged from the ground. The exterior was scarred and stained by years of exposure. One corner had cracked, revealing part of a plastic seal underneath. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. He had spent decades around evidence storage containers. This one looked familiar. Too familiar. Back at the cabin, he placed the container on the kitchen table. Axel lay nearby watching every movement. Daniel carefully opened the damaged seal. Inside were several objects protected within layers of plastic wrapping. The first item was a portable police radio. Water damage covered most of its surface. The second was a small notebook with swollen pages and faded writing. Then Daniel discovered the final object. A police badge. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Daniel picked up the badge and examined the identification number engraved beneath years of discoloration. Recognition arrived instantly. He had seen that number before. Not recently. Years ago. The badge belonged to Officer Michael Grady. Daniel slowly lowered it back onto the table. Michael Grady's disappearance had once dominated regional news coverage. 8 years earlier, the officer vanished during what was officially described as a severe weather incident. His patrol vehicle was eventually recovered near a river several counties away. Despite extensive searches, Grady himself was never found. Eventually investigators concluded he had likely died during the incident. The case was closed. The story faded. Most people forgot about it. Daniel had not thought about Michael Grady in years. Until now. He immediately began reviewing public records. News archives. Old reports. Court filings. Everything still available online. The official version remained consistent across every source. Missing officer. Accidental disappearance. Investigation completed. Yet one detail immediately caught his attention. According to the original reports, most of Grady's personal equipment had never been recovered, including his badge. Daniel looked back at the object resting on the table. If the badge had never been found, how had it ended up buried beneath the frozen shoreline of Greystone Lake? The question refused to leave him. Hours passed as he dug deeper into archived material. Then another detail emerged. Michael Grady's final documented assignment before his disappearance had not involved violent crime, narcotics, or fugitive investigations. He had been conducting a review connected to infrastructure operations near a flood control facility outside town. Daniel felt his Stomach tighten. He opened a map. Checked the location twice. Then a third time. The assignment address matched the same flood control tunnel where Axel had been trapped during the storm. Silence filled the cabin. Daniel stared at the screen. Axel slowly lifted his head from the floor. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the lake. Inside, two separate stories that should never have been connected had just collided. And for the first time, Daniel began to suspect that Axel had not led him to forgotten evidence. The dog had led him back to the beginning of something that was never truly finished. Daniel Mercer spent the next several days treating Michael Grady's disappearance the way he would have treated any unsolved case during his years in law enforcement. He stopped assuming the official story was correct. Instead, he started with the facts. A missing officer. A recovered patrol vehicle. A badge discovered 8 years later beneath the frozen shoreline of Greystone Lake. And a final assignment connected to the same flood control facility where Axel had nearly died. The deeper Daniel looked, the less comfortable he became. Every morning, he spread documents across the dining table inside the cabin. Every evening, he added more notes. The damaged notebook recovered from the waterproof container provided little help. Most of the writing had been destroyed by moisture and time. The radio no longer functioned. But the badge remained undeniable. It should not have been where Axel found it. That fact alone was enough to keep Daniel digging. He requested archived public records and reviewed old newspaper reports. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Michael Grady disappeared during severe weather. Search teams responded. Investigators followed available leads. The patrol vehicle was eventually recovered downstream near a river crossing. The conclusion seemed straightforward. Then Daniel started comparing dates. Small inconsistencies began appearing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would attract attention during a casual review. Yet together they formed a pattern. One report placed Grady near the flood control facility shortly before his disappearance. Another suggested he was already miles away during the same period. A witness statement mentioned seeing emergency vehicles near a maintenance access road that never appeared in the final investigative summary. Equipment inventories referenced collected evidence that later vanished from official records. Daniel circled every discrepancy. By the third day, his notebook contained more questions than answers. Then he discovered something that stopped him completely. According to archived maintenance records, repair work had been conducted inside the flood control tunnel less than 2 weeks after Michael Grady disappeared. The repairs were classified as emergency structural modifications. Several sections of the tunnel were altered. One area was permanently sealed. Daniel immediately requested the engineering diagrams connected to the project. Hours later, he sat staring at digital blueprints spread across his computer screen. A section of the tunnel had indeed been closed. Not because of collapse damage. Not because of flooding. The documents described it as unnecessary access space. Daniel frowned. The explanation felt unusually vague. Then he noticed a familiar name attached to the authorization paperwork. Richard Holloway. Daniel leaned back slowly. The room felt colder. Holloway was not just another administrator. He had been one of the key officials involved in Daniel's disciplinary review after the Axel rescue. The same man who showed almost no reaction when the dog emerged alive from the tunnel. The same man who had pushed aggressively for policy enforcement afterward. Daniel stared at the signature. Coincidence was still possible. But his instincts were beginning to disagree. That evening, he reviewed old photographs from department events connected to infrastructure projects. Most showed ribbon cuttings, press conferences, and public safety demonstrations. Then one image caught his attention. Richard Holloway stood beside several local officials during a ceremony at the flood control site years earlier. Standing a few feet away was Thomas Vance. Daniel recognized him immediately from television appearances and emergency preparedness campaigns. At first, the photograph seemed unimportant. Then Daniel remembered seeing the same image hanging inside the conference room where his termination review had taken place. Strange details often mattered in investigations. Not because they proved anything. Because they revealed connections. Daniel printed the photograph and pinned it beside his growing timeline. Later that night, he stepped outside onto the porch. The lake stretched silently beneath the moonlight. Axel stood near the edge of the dock looking toward the dark shoreline. The German Shepherd had become unusually alert whenever Daniel worked on the Grady case. As if the dog sensed they were moving closer to something hidden. Daniel followed Axel's gaze across the frozen water. 8 years earlier, Michael Grady disappeared after investigating the flood control facility. Weeks later, part of that same facility was permanently altered. Years later, Axel led Daniel to evidence tied directly to the missing officer. None of it proved a conspiracy. Not yet. But for the first time, Daniel felt certain of one thing. Michael Grady's case had not been solved. It had been closed. And those were not the same thing. The breakthrough arrived on a Thursday afternoon while snow drifted lazily across Greystone Lake. Daniel Mercer sat alone at the dining table surrounded by stacks of records, engineering diagrams, and handwritten notes. The investigation had grown far beyond a missing badge or a forgotten case. Every path seemed to lead back to the flood control facility. Every timeline eventually crossed the same location. Yet one question still bothered him. Why had Michael Grady been there in the first place? According to the official narrative, Grady's disappearance was unrelated to criminal activity. He was not investigating a homicide. He was not working narcotics. He was not tracking a fugitive. So what had drawn him to the flood control site only days before he vanished? Daniel returned to archive procurement records and infrastructure reports connected to the region during that period. Most of the documents were ordinary. Equipment purchases. Maintenance budgets. Contract renewals. The kind of paperwork almost nobody reads unless they are paid to. Then one company name appeared again and again. North Valley Aviation Services. Daniel frowned. The company operated emergency helicopters used during search and rescue operations and disaster response missions. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But the more he reviewed the records, the stranger the numbers became. Several invoices billed for helicopter deployments that did not appear in publicly available flight records. Fuel purchases exceeded documented flight hours by significant margins. Maintenance expenses were attached to aircraft listed as inactive during the same period. None of the discrepancies proved wrongdoing. Yet together they formed a pattern Daniel could not ignore. He printed every relevant document and spread them across the table. By evening, a new timeline had emerged. Michael Grady's final assignment was no longer centered on the flood control facility itself. The tunnel was only part of the story. The real focus appeared to be a financial review involving emergency aviation contracts. Daniel leaned back and stared at the wall. Grady had been following money. The realization changed everything. Missing people sometimes left questions behind. Missing money almost always left trails. Daniel continued searching. Hours later he located an archived internal request submitted by Michael Grady less than a week before his disappearance. Most of the document had been redacted. But one section remained visible. Grady had requested access to contract records involving North Valley Aviation Services and a regional emergency operations partnership. Daniel read the page twice. Then a third time. Michael Grady had been investigating the same contracts now sitting on Daniel's table. Outside, darkness settled over the lake. Inside, another piece of the puzzle slid into place. Then Daniel remembered the photograph. He pulled it from the wall and studied it again. Richard Holloway stood near the center. Beside him were local officials. Construction managers. Public safety representatives. And Thomas Vance. Daniel opened his laptop and began researching Vance's consulting history. The results appeared immediately. Over the years, Vance had advised multiple emergency management projects throughout the region. Several involved aviation services. Several involved infrastructure funding. Several intersected directly with organizations appearing inside Daniel's growing investigation. None of it proved corruption. But the connections were impossible to ignore. As midnight approached, Axel rose from beside the fireplace and walked toward the table. The German Shepherd rarely paid attention to paperwork. Yet tonight he stopped beside the photograph. His eyes fixed on Thomas Vance. Not Holloway. Not the officials. Only Vance. Daniel watched carefully. The dog remained completely still. Then a memory surfaced. During the rescue months earlier, Axel had twice stopped inside the tunnel and looked toward a dark side corridor before continuing toward the exit. At the time Daniel assumed the dog was disoriented. Now he was not so sure. He unfolded the engineering blueprint again and examined the sealed section near the tunnel. Hidden beneath one maintenance chamber was a secondary storage area connected to emergency operations support. Aviation equipment had reportedly been staged there years ago. Daniel felt a slow chill move through him. Aviation contracts. A missing officer. A sealed tunnel chamber. Thomas Vance. Richard Holloway. None of the pieces should have fit together. Yet somehow they did. Across the room, Axel remained staring at the photograph. Daniel followed the dog's gaze toward the smiling consultant standing quietly in the background. And for reasons he could not fully explain, he suddenly felt certain that Thomas Vance was not just another name in the file. He was the connection everyone else had somehow overlooked. 2 days later, Daniel Mercer returned to the flood control facility for the first time since the night he rescued Axel. Winter clouds hung low over the valley. Wind pushed loose snow across the empty access roads. The place looked abandoned now. No emergency crews. No maintenance vehicles. No flashing lights. Only silence. Daniel parked nearly half a mile away and approached on foot with Axel walking beside him. The closer they got to the tunnel entrance, the more focused the German Shepherd became. His pace changed. His ears remained forward. Several times he glanced toward the same section of the structure before continuing. Daniel noticed every movement. The behavior reminded him of a working dog approaching a known location rather than an unfamiliar one. That realization stayed with him as they entered the tunnel. Their footsteps echoed softly through the darkness. Water still flowed through the lower channels, though much more slowly than during the storm. Daniel followed the engineering diagrams he had studied for days. According to the maintenance records, the permanently sealed section should have been less than 50 feet from the location where Axel had been trapped. The distance bothered him. On the night of the rescue, he had been closer to that area than he ever realized. Eventually they reached the section marked on the blueprint. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. The concrete wall stretched across the corridor exactly as the records described. Old. Stained. Ordinary. Daniel stood silently studying it. Then Axel moved forward. The German Shepherd walked directly to one specific spot and pressed his nose against the surface. He remained there without moving. Daniel slowly approached. "What is it?" Axel did not react. His attention never left the wall. Daniel aimed his flashlight across the concrete. The beam moved slowly from left to right. Then he saw it. A faint outline hidden beneath years of repairs and discoloration. Not a crack. Not a repair seam. A rectangular shape. Almost invisible unless someone knew where to look. Daniel stepped closer. The outline resembled a doorway. His pulse quickened. He examined the surrounding surface more carefully. Fresh concrete had been applied years earlier to disguise the original structure. The workmanship was excellent. Most people would never notice. Yet once the outline revealed itself, it became impossible to ignore. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. Then another memory surfaced. The rescue night. Axel stopping twice and looking toward this exact direction before continuing toward the exit. At the time Daniel assumed the dog was disoriented. Now the memory felt completely different. As he studied the wall, another realization arrived. On the night of the rescue, he had passed within a few yards of this hidden doorway. If the collapse had occurred slightly farther back. If Axel had been trapped slightly deeper inside the tunnel. If Daniel had searched for even a few more minutes. He might have discovered it himself. Silence settled heavily around him. Suddenly his termination looked different. For months Daniel believed he lost his career because he disobeyed orders to save a dog. But now another possibility emerged. What if the rescue itself was not the real problem? What if someone became alarmed because Daniel had entered a section of tunnel connected to a hidden chamber? What if the concern was not what he had done, but what he might have seen? Back at the cabin, Daniel returned to the administrative records from his termination review. This time he focused on dates rather than statements. The pattern appeared immediately. Richard Holloway initiated the first formal disciplinary recommendation less than 48 hours after the rescue. Faster than normal policy required. Faster than most internal reviews ever moved. Daniel continued digging. Then he found another document. A maintenance authorization approved just 2 days after the rescue. The location referenced the same tunnel corridor containing the hidden doorway. According to the paperwork, contractors entered the area during the night and removed archived materials from a storage chamber before sealing additional access points. Daniel stared at the page. The timing felt impossible to dismiss. Suddenly everything aligned. Michael Grady's disappearance. The sealed chamber. The aviation contracts. The rushed repairs. His termination. For the first time, Daniel understood the truth. He had not been removed because he saved Axel. He had been removed because saving Axel brought him dangerously close to a secret that somebody believed was still buried beneath the tunnel. And standing beside the table, Axel watched quietly as if he had known it all along. For the next 3 days, Daniel Mercer barely left the cabin. Sleep became an afterthought. Coffee cups accumulated across the dining table while documents, photographs, timelines, and engineering records covered nearly every available surface. Outside, winter storms rolled across Greystone Lake. Inside, Daniel focused on a single goal. He needed to prove what his instincts were already telling him. The hidden chamber beneath the flood control facility was not an accident. And his termination had not been a coincidence. Late on the third night, he found what he had been looking for. Buried inside a collection of archived contractor invoices was a transportation record connected to the tunnel. The document had been overlooked because it appeared routine. Equipment relocation. Storage transfer. Administrative authorization. Yet the date immediately caught Daniel's attention. The transfer occurred less than 24 hours after Axel's rescue. He read the page again. Then again. According to the record, multiple sealed containers had been removed from the chamber area during an overnight operation supervised by contractors working under emergency authorization. The approval signature belonged to Richard Holloway. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He pulled additional records. Within an hour, another detail emerged. The first recommendation supporting disciplinary action against Daniel had been submitted less than 48 hours after the rescue. The timing aligned almost perfectly. Axel was rescued. Contractors entered the tunnel. Materials were removed. Daniel was targeted for termination. One event followed the next like falling dominoes. For several minutes, Daniel sat silently staring at the wall covered in evidence. Then the final realization arrived. Holloway and the others may never have known whether Daniel actually discovered the hidden chamber. That was not the point. The problem was uncertainty. Daniel had entered a section of tunnel no one expected him to enter. He had spent time near the concealed doorway. He had ignored direct orders and reached an area that should have remained untouched. To the people protecting the secret, that alone made him a risk. Suddenly everything made sense. He was not punished because he saved Axel. He was removed because saving Axel placed him in the wrong location at the wrong moment. The rescue was merely the excuse. The secret was the reason. Across the room, Axel rested near the fireplace. The German shepherd opened his eyes briefly and watched Daniel in silence. For months the dog had been leading him back toward this conclusion. Not through words. Through instinct. Through memory. Through places nobody else thought to revisit. Daniel organized everything into digital files before dawn. Every photograph. Every record. Every timeline. Every connection linking Michael Grady, Thomas Vance, Richard Holloway, North Valley Aviation Services, and the hidden chamber beneath the tunnel. He planned to send copies to federal investigators the following morning. Independent agencies. People outside the region. People beyond local influence. It was the safest option. The only option. That evening, the sky darkened unusually early. Thick clouds covered the mountains. Wind disappeared completely. The silence felt unnatural. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the lights inside the cabin flickered. Once. Then twice. Then everything went dark. The fireplace provided the only remaining light. Daniel stood immediately. Axel was already on his feet. The German Shepherd moved toward the front window and stared into the darkness beyond the trees. Daniel pulled back the curtain slightly. At first he saw nothing. Then distant headlights appeared on the access road leading toward the lake. One vehicle. Then another. Then a third. They moved slowly through the snow before stopping several hundred yards from the property. No emergency lights. No markings. No sirens. Just silent vehicles sitting in the darkness. Daniel watched for nearly 20 minutes. Nobody approached the cabin. Nobody exited the vehicles. Eventually the headlights disappeared. The road became empty once more. Yet the message felt clear. Someone knew where he was. Someone knew he had been asking questions. Someone was paying attention. Daniel spent the rest of the night awake. Shortly before sunrise, he finished preparing every file for transfer. The evidence sat ready beside his laptop. Axel remained near the door, alert and watchful. Then, as the first pale light appeared over Greystone Lake, a distant sound rolled across the frozen valley. Deep. Rhythmic. Familiar. Daniel stepped onto the porch and looked toward the eastern horizon. Far beyond the lake, 3 helicopters emerged from the morning clouds and began flying directly toward his cabin. The helicopters crossed above Greystone Lake just as the first light of dawn touched the frozen shoreline. Their rotors echoed across the valley, scattering loose snow from the treetops and sending waves of white powder drifting across the ice. Daniel Mercer stood on the porch beside Axel, watching them approach. After everything he had uncovered, only one possibility seemed logical. Someone had finally decided to stop him. The aircraft descended slowly and settled onto the lake several hundred yards from the cabin. Snow swirled beneath the rotor wash. Doors opened. Figures stepped out wearing heavy winter jackets and carrying equipment cases. Daniel immediately noticed something unexpected. These were not local officers. They were not members of his former department. Several jackets displayed federal agency markings. Axel remained alert but calm. The German Shepherd stood slightly in front of Daniel, watching every movement. Minutes later, a gray-haired investigator approached the cabin carrying a weatherproof case. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and removed his gloves. "Officer Mercer." Daniel nodded cautiously. The investigator extended a hand. "My name is Robert Hayes. We have been looking into Michael Grady's disappearance for quite some time." Daniel said nothing. The man opened the case and removed several folders. Photographs. Financial records. Audit reports. Daniel recognized many of the names immediately. Thomas Vance. Richard Holloway. North Valley Aviation Services. The investigator watched his reaction carefully. "You are not the first person who noticed the inconsistencies," Hayes said. "You are the first person who connected all of them." For the next 2 hours, Daniel shared everything. The badge. The radio. The engineering records. The hidden doorway. The transfer documents. The timelines. The federal team copied every file he had assembled. As the evidence was reviewed, a larger picture finally emerged. Years earlier, Michael Grady had discovered irregularities involving emergency aviation contracts and infrastructure funding. Before he could complete his investigation, the inquiry disappeared. Records were moved. Reports were altered. Questions stopped being asked. The hidden chamber beneath the tunnel became a storage location for documents that should never have remained there. When Axel became trapped inside the tunnel years later, nobody expected Daniel Mercer to ignore orders and enter the restricted area. Nobody expected him to come within yards of the concealed chamber. And nobody expected Axel to survive and eventually lead him back to evidence connected to Michael Grady. Then Hayes revealed the final piece. Thomas Vance had never been merely a consultant standing in the background of photographs. According to years of financial records and communications uncovered during the federal inquiry, Vance had quietly served as the central link connecting infrastructure projects, aviation contracts, and decision-makers across multiple agencies. His public image as a respected emergency preparedness expert had concealed a far different role behind closed doors. Richard Holloway had not been the architect of the operation. He had been one of its protectors. Vance was the man investigators believed sat at the center. Daniel looked down at the photograph that had started so many questions months earlier. The smiling man standing behind everyone else suddenly made sense. The reason Vance appeared in so many places was because he had spent years positioning himself exactly where influence, funding, and oversight intersected. Michael Grady had begun uncovering that truth. Daniel had unknowingly completed the path Grady started. The investigator looked toward the German Shepherd resting quietly near the fireplace. That dog may have preserved a case that would have been lost forever. Daniel followed his gaze. For a moment neither man spoke. Over the following weeks, federal investigators executed search warrants, reviewed financial records, and conducted interviews across multiple jurisdictions. The process unfolded quietly. No dramatic press conferences. No televised arrests. Just patient investigation. Some careers ended. Some reputations collapsed. Among the most shocking revelations was the fall of Thomas Vance, a man many people once considered one of the most trusted voices in public safety. Through it all, Daniel remained at the cabin. He gave statements when requested and then returned to his quiet life beside the lake. Spring arrived slowly. Ice retreated from the shoreline. The frozen reeds where Axel first discovered the buried container emerged once again from the thawing ground. One morning, nearly 2 months after the helicopters landed, Daniel sat alone at the end of the wooden dock. The lake was calm. The mountains reflected across the water beneath a pale blue sky. Beside him lay Axel. Older now. Slower than before. But peaceful. The wind moved softly through the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter crossed the horizon. Its sound drifted faintly across the valley before gradually fading away. Daniel watched it for a moment, then lowered his eyes toward the lake. He never received an apology. He never asked for one. Some truths arrive too late to repair what was lost. Yet sitting there beside the dog who refused to forget, Daniel realized something important. The evidence had always been there. The reports. The contracts. The signatures. The timelines. Everything investigators needed had existed for years. What was missing was the story connecting them together. And that story survived because one old German shepherd kept returning to the same place night after night until someone finally paid attention. The morning sun climbed higher above the water. Daniel remained still. Axel slowly lifted his head and looked across the lake toward the distant shoreline. Then he settled back down beside the dock. The wind moved through his coat. The reeds swayed gently in the sunlight. And there, in the quiet that followed, the story finally came to rest.